Malbim Haggadah. Oh, you want to film visually? Better. Great. Thank you. There's something called the Malbim Haggadah, which is not actually very unlikely to be written exactly by the Malbim. I think if you look carefully at the actual cover page of it in the standard prints, if you look in the small print, you'll see it's not by the Malbim. But anyway, one way or the other, it's got some very brilliant insights, a lot of the Malbim's insights. And there, it famously says that it maps the Haggadah around the pasuk of V'higadat levincha b'yomahu leimar. The pasuk, the verse that the Torah itself says, you should tell your child on that day, saying, "Ba'avor zeh, because of this, Asa Hashem li b'tzeisi Mitzrayim." God acted for me when He took me out of Egypt. That verse, first of all, appears many, many times in the Haggadah. We already had it twice. Where have we had it so far? Just yesterday's reminder. You should tell your child, it's literally the word Haggadah. You should do a Haggadah to your child. Tell your child on that day, saying, because of this, God acted for me when He took me out of Egypt. We had it for the cynical, the negative child, and we also had it for the child doesn't ask questions. That's why it really appears in the Torah. We also then, we didn't go through this yesterday, but straight after that, you have Yochel Rosh Chodesh. You might think, we have a little funny brisa that just kind of analyzes how we know the mitzvah of doing the Haggadah is on the night of Pesach, and it learns it from the same verse. Yochel Rosh Chodesh, you might have thought it should have been from the beginning of the month of Nisan. Just by the way, why on earth would you think you do the Haggadah on the beginning of the month of Nisan, 2 weeks before Seder night?
That's what Moshe was commanded.
Right, very good, because that's when in the Torah itself, God spoke to Moshe and gave him all this instruction. So you might think every year on that day, we should do the same thing. Talmud Lomas, the verse comes to tell you by Yom Hahu, it's got to be on that day. In other words, you should tell your child by Yom Hahu on that day. If it's that day, you might think it's during the day. Why would you think it's during the day? Because that's when you bring the Korban Pesach, right? So no, Ba'avor zeh, it's got to be because of this. You basically got to be able to point and say this food, the Korban Pesach, the matzah, the maror, that's why Hashem took me out of Egypt. So that's the third time that verse appears in the Haggadah. When's the fourth time it appears in the Haggadah? It actually appears without appearing, when Rabban Gamliel tells us anyone who hasn't said these three things on Pesach doesn't fulfill the duty. Pesach, matzah, maror, and you've got to point. Pesach, well, we don't have a Pesach to point to, but matzah, maror, you've got to point. In other words, you've got to explain why the food of the night is why God took us out of Egypt. So that's implicitly once. So 3 times explicitly, once implicitly. And then we have this line of B'chol dor v'dor. In every generation, we saw yesterday, it's a Mishnah in Pesachim. Every generation, a person has to see himself as if he came out of Egypt. As it says, God acted for me when He took me out of Egypt. So it appears explicitly in the Haggadah 4 times and implicitly a 5th time. The Malbim Haggadah says that in fact it's this message which keeps occurring again and again in the Haggadah, and in fact is one of the sources of the word Haggadah. There's 2 places in Torah where you use the word Haggadah in the context of talking about roughly talking about coming out of Egypt. This is the main one. V'higadat levincha, you should do a Haggadah on that day to your child. The Malbim Haggadah says this is forms the meta structure of the whole Haggadah. Right, this is kind of the map that the Mishnah was using. The Haggadah is a question and answer, so you've got to get questions going. Levincha, we then define who the child is. Right, that's the Mishnah that says Lefidato shel ben aviv melamdo, according to the awareness, the consciousness, and knowledge of the child, the parent teaches them, which is why we then have the brisa going through the 4 different types of children. By Yom Hahu on that day, which is why the Haggadah then stops and analyzes which day it is. Leimar saying. Right, that's where we have this whole long conversation. And then Ba'avor zeh, because of this, because of Pesach, matzah, maror, Asa Hashem li, God acted for me. That's the bit about acting for me. B'tzeisi Mitzrayim, He took me out of Egypt, and of course that becomes the halal and B'tzeisi Yisrael Mitzrayim. We talk about coming out of Egypt. So that is interesting. In other words, it forms the meta structure of the Haggadah. One way or another, we then get to the core. In the beginning, our ancestors were pagans, idol worshippers, and now God's drawn us near to His service. Now, this fulfills the Gemara that we mentioned yesterday. The Mishnah said, you start from the negative, go to the positive. In the Gemara, you got Rav and Shmuel. Shmuel says that just say we were slaves, we became free. Rav says, no, you got to say, in the beginning we were idol worshippers, and then we God drew us near to his service. Now, we were slaves who became free, we've already done in the Haggadah. That's again, just to recap from yesterday, that was using the verse that we use in Vaischanan for the wise child and son. We use that line, but now we get to Rav's view that you can't just talk about coming out of Egypt. You've got to contextualize it far further, and that is not obvious. It's not the most obvious thing that because we said we want to go back to Egypt. We are joining the Bnei Yisrael. We're joining the Israelites on their last night in Egypt. Why is it important to jump backwards in time 400 years and go back to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? And in fact, we quote a pasuk right from the end of Yeshua's life. One of his big final 2 speeches he gives to the Jewish people. And he says to the people, Koyom Hashem L'Keisal, says Hashem God of Israel, Be'eva Anar Yashav, your ancestors forever, they lived on the other side of the river. Terach, father of Abraham, father of Nachor, they served other gods, idols. I took your father Abraham, walked him through the whole land of Canaan, gave him lots of children, and I particularly gave him Yitzchak. I gave Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Esav. Esav got a different inheritance. Yaakov and his sons went down to Egypt. In other words, we're quoting the verses from Yehoshua, who gave this big speech. He's telling the Jewish people effectively a micro summary of their history. And do you have a Tanakh here on the shelf? There, just over there. It's good here behind you. Shelf A2. That's it, yeah. Shkayach, thank you. So if you look, why is Yehoshua giving this why is he suddenly giving us the historical recap? What's happening over here? So he's leaving us behind, he's giving his kind of farewell speeches, and so here we go. Yeah, this is basically, I mean, essentially it's his last speech, right? And he's saying, he's gathered everyone to Shechem, and he tells them all this, and then he carries on and says, and now I sent Moshe and Aaron, who brought all the plagues to Egypt. Literally the next pasuk after that is, Va'eshlach as Moshe was Aaron, I gave Moshe and Aaron, I smote the Egyptians, right? And then I took you out of Egypt, and I took your ancestors out of Egypt. I crossed the sea, Egyptians chased them, they cried out to Hashem, like a recap of the main story of coming out of Egypt. Okay, obviously we stop because we're going to do that anyway in the Haggadah. And then we talk about Balak, all the troubles that they went through and all the times Hashem saved us on the way into the land. And essentially what Yeshua concludes is, therefore you got to fear Hashem. Yiras Hashem ivdu b'samim. Fear Hashem, serve him well and in truth, and so on. Now it raises an interesting question, Yeshua's speech, and it's going to be an important question for the Haggadah in general. Why are these the important things to tell the Jewish people if you want to tell them to obey Hashem? Say he gave us a Torah. Say he gave us the law. That's how Yeshua opens, right? God telling him, be brave and courageous in war, and be brave and courageous in keeping the Torah, and deal with it day and night, and so on. So what happened to the Torah? Why are we only dealing with all the troubles and so on? And there's a very profound answer that comes out of a lot of commentaries here, but we'll hold it in the background just for now, and Bez Hashem answer it soon. But either way, we see that Yeshua, before he spoke about the fact that Hashem took us out of Egypt and then saved us from lots of enemies and all these troubles, went all the way back in time and said, you got to know, in the beginning you were idol worshippers. Why is that important? What's that got to do with anything? The theme there is God keeps saving us. So if you want God to keep saving us, obey him. Right? That's the theme. What's it got to do with Avraham being idol worshippers? And why is the Haggadah bringing that in here now? If anything, it should bring the bit about coming out of Egypt. Why do we go back in time? And then the Haggadah says this: Baruch Shem Avtachos Yisrael, blessed is the one who kept his promise to Israel. Blessed is he that Kadosh Baruch Hu Chishev Esaketz. He calculated the end to do what he promised Avraham in the Bris Bein Absarim, the covenant of the parts, when he said, Yada Teidai, you will surely know. Avraham had just asked him the question, Bama Eda Kirashena. God, I know you're promising me this land, but how do I know I'll inherit it? Very strange question. It's like, God says you can have children, fine, he believes that and it's considered good. They're going to inherit the land, how do I know? Because God just told you. What do you mean? How? Because God's saying, I control history, I'm the creator of this universe, I can do this stuff. Now, how do I know I can trust you, God? It's also very strange because what could God possibly answer at that point? I'll show you a vision of the future. How do I know that's the truth? right? I'll guarantee. If you've got a question about God, then what answer can you ever have? And interestingly enough, God gives them this answer. He says, take these calves and these different animals. He cuts them up and he goes into this deep sleep and then he says, Yodoa Teda, you will surely know, Ki Geri Zaracha, because your children will be strangers, Be'eretz Lo Lahem, in a land that is not theirs. Ve'avodum, they'll be enslaved. Ve'inoisim, they'll be afflicted. Arba Me'eshon, it's all going to be 400 years in the future. Ve'gamas Agoya Sheya Voidudon Anoichi, also the nation that enslaves them, I will judge. Ve'achrei Chen Yetzim B'chush Gadol, then they'll go out with great wealth. So how did that answer the question? Abraham's got a question. How did I can believe you about the future? I'll tell you a few more things. Oh, okay, fine. Well, what's the meaning? So there's many sources make this point. The Maharal makes this very strongly. Rabbi Isaac Chav in his Haggadah runs this all the way through. There's some very strong, and I'm going to bring out this principle right now. First, if you look at Rashi, and then we carry on just before we get to the answer, just look at what the next line in the Haggadah is. This stood our ancestors and us. Because not only one tried to destroy us, every generation they want to destroy us. Hashem saves us. Go and learn from Lavan, and then we segue into the 4 verses of the farmer's first fruit declaration that is the core of the Haggadah. Okay, now I don't know. I can't say I've been to every Seder in the world, but as a kid I used to often go to different Sedarim. And different years we were different people, and often people would ask the question, what stood for our ancestors and us? And if you're going very slowly through the Haggadah, you can actually ask that question. But if you're reading the Haggadah, the Haggadah just told you the promise that Hashem made at the Bris Bein Absarim guaranteed that we'll survive in every generation. Because in every generation they want to destroy us, and it's that promise of the covenant of the past, the promise that God says you're going to go into Egypt, be slaves, and come out the other side, that has stood us through every single generation. How is a very important question, but that is black and white in the Haggadah. In other words, so this is true with everything you learn Jewishly in Torah. You can zoom into the micro details, but you've got to zoom out again and look at the forest thing. And where's the map going here? Otherwise you get all lost everywhere, right? So, again, we were originally pagans, we became free. Thank Hashem that he gave this promise to Avraham, that he did everything he promised at the Bris Bein Absarim, which we've got a lot of questions about, and somehow that Bris Bein Absarim solves all the problems in every generation and guarantees we're going to survive. Of course, we begin to hear that's how it answered Avraham's questions somehow. But let's try and understand what's going on over here. Yeah.
I remember a few weeks ago in your Parsha Shiur, you talked about how to Moshe, is it that Hashem reverted to his Rachmanas from fear of Abraham, and because he kept the part of the covenant that he brought them down to Egypt, so too we'll bring them back up.
Okay, good. You're onto something. Now we want to go a little bit deeper today. First of all, shkoyach, we're listening to the Parsha Shiur. Let's get points for that. But second of all, let's go a little deeper into that. What's the correlation? How does it answer Abraham's question? So if you look at Rashi on the Torah, when Rashi actually comments on this strange question of Abraham, how do I know I'll inherit it? Rashi brings the Medrash, says, Shema Yigroi Machet. Maybe the sin will get in the way. In other words, it seems there are things God can promise that are implicitly come with an if they deserve it clause. And Avraham assumed that this must apply to inheriting the land, which makes sense from the very first Rashi in the Torah. God gives this land to whoever deserves it in his eyes. So it's a deserving basis. This is the place out of which the world to come will emerge. The Messianic era will come from, the temple will be rebuilt, the world to come will come out of here. This isn't just a random, nice tribal ancestral land somewhere on planet Earth. There's a lot more to it. And so Avraham says, so surely this is something you have to merit. If it isn't something you have to merit, what's the purpose of history? Right? You're going to be the conduits, and if they are going, I'm going to elaborate slightly the way the Maharal does, because you could ask, who says, where's Yigroi Machet? Maybe not. Maybe Hashem's promised you, and he's just... So the Maharal explains that in other words, he understood that inheriting the land of Israel is not just, like I said, not just an ancestral land. It's being at the epicenter of history. It's being the place out of which all God's vision for mankind is going to be generated, and therefore you have to deserve it. But have to deserve it, by definition, means you have to have free will. And free will, by definition, means you could mess up. In other words, God, you seem to be on the horns of a dilemma. If you're going to promise me that you're going to take away their free will and make them succeed. What's the purpose? That's meaningless. If you're going to, we are going to have free will, which is the whole point of life, then you can't promise me they're going to succeed. And to that, God says, no. Going into Egypt actually is part of this journey. And this is why we began with the Betchila. In the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers. In other words, you have to contextualize the whole coming out of Egypt in this context. And I often make this point. You see, there is a problem. You could have a big question on the whole Seder night. If we just said the Seder night is we were slaves, we became free, the obvious question would be, that's very nice, God, you took us out of Egypt, but who got us in there in the first place? You did. So why are we thanking you? Like, you put somebody in prison, then you release them. Thank you for releasing us, but who put us in there in the first place? And just in case you want to say, no. Theologically, we think God doesn't really get involved in the way the world works, and the Egyptians were being cruel, and then God came in and saved us. We want to give him the credit, but not. Well, the Haggadah disagrees. The Torah disagrees. God promised Avraham, your children are going to be slaves in land that is not theirs. So what's happening is the Haggadah, and Yeshua himself says, you need to contextualize everything that went on in terms of a much bigger picture, and that's where the Haggadah is going to. This is not a picture of we were slaves, we became free. That's part of the story. The zoom out is, this was the journey of becoming God's partners in changing the world. This is the journey from a world of idolatry, which is a deeply self-centered, self-serving world. Idolatry is always about self-service, because all the gods that are worshipped in idolatrous systems are always there to serve us if we know how to manipulate them correctly. That's what they do. The rain god gives you rain as long as you give it ego boost, a sacrifice, or something, right? And the sun god will do the same thing, and the love god, and the war god, and the this god, and the that god. They're all ways of serving the human being. The Rambam says in the beginning of Avodah Zarah, says in the beginning all mankind knew about one God, Adam knew about one God, and so on. But then they made a big mistake. They started saying, just like we honor a king by honoring his servants and messengers, so too we should honor God's servants and messengers, the sun, the moon, the rain, all the stuff. And they started building temples to worship them, and that was already the beginning of idolatry. Then they forgot about God. Now, you might say that idolatry begins when they cut God out and just start serving all these other things. But the Rambam seems to say no. The minute they began to serve something as well as God, or serve something as a servant of God, it was already idolatrous. Why? Because these things have no free will. It's not like a servant of a king who chooses to serve the king, so you honor them. These things have no free will, but more importantly, the impetus to serve them comes because it's so hard to relate to God who's so abstract. More than that, which bit of God helps me? The fact that he gives the sun and the rain and makes wars be successful and gives love. And so they're looking for not God, but which bit of God serves us. So idolatry is really about worshipping the self. The item of worship in every idolatrous system is the self. Deep in the subconscious of humanity, it will usually look like a figure of a human being as well. And that echoes with the fact that ultimately it's the human who's being worshipped. And it might also be ancestor worship and other things as well, but I'm just going with the Rambam's explanation. In other words, when it becomes how do one manipulate the spiritual worlds and God's worlds in order to get what we want out of it, that's idolatry. And that's a very dangerous world. We know what the pagan world looked like. We know what it meant in terms of infanticide. We know what it meant in terms of injustice. We know what it meant in terms of restricting education. We know all the horrors of that world. The journey of building the godly system begins long before Egypt. It begins with Avraham and Sarah, who are the first to really discover God alone, but also have a mission of magnifying God's presence and bringing chesed, to the kindness to the world. Within them, there's only one child who fully continues their mission, at least throughout his entire life, and gets the brachos to do so, and that's Yitzchak and Yaakov. And then within Yaakov, Esau goes wrong, Yaakov goes right. And only then, after 3 generations, only by the time of Yaakov, do we finally get somebody where the continuity is much stronger, where every single one of their children follows their pathway. There's still problems in the family, but for the first time, you've got the spiritual equivalent of a gene that can be passed on into the future. And now we have a family, we have a new name for that family called Yisrael, Israel. And now what happens? That it gets planted in Egypt. And here, if you look at the Ramchal, he sees in the Derech Hashem, You see this in lots of different sources. You'll see that what really happens now is this seed in Egypt undergoes a decomposition. We're about to use the metaphor of the seed in the Haggadah. It will come up soon, right? An apostle in Yechezkel. But the interesting thing about a seed, when you plant it in the ground, is it decomposes. I think sort of Chanonah makes this point that if a person never seen a seed being planted before, they would think it was dying in the ground. If they could actually look underground, they'd literally see it decomposing. So, and that's like what's happening in Egypt. That's like what happens very often in life, right? Is that it looks like everything's falling apart. And actually what's happening is everything except the most essential thing is falling apart, and the most essential thing is about to undergo a radical transformation. You see, before we went into Egypt, and before we were in Egypt, Avram, Yitzhak, Yaakov, these ancestral generations had lots of reasons that they could rely upon for their survival. Lots of things, lots of factors they could rely upon that could guarantee their continuity and survival. One, they were diplomatically very powerful. They were highly respected people. They were very wealthy. Number two. Number three, they even had militias. Avram had not a very large one, but he had one he could call upon when he needed. But number four, they were also spiritually full of angels moving in and out their life. They had physical, spiritual, naturally very strong ability to survive and thrive in the world. So yes, they had their relationship with God, but they also had the angels, they also had their natural power, they also had lots of things going on. In Egypt, all of that is stripped away. They lose everything. And we'll see that as it goes through the Psukim. And the idea is that what happens when the seed is planted and decomposes and everything is taken away is there's only one basis left for their survival. And that basis is going to be in the Haggadah, is going to be the relationship with God. And the purpose of all of this is that what will come out of Egypt, now I'm going back to the language of the Maharal, what will come out of Egypt is not a nation like every other nation, plus we're going to get a Torah. What's going to come out of Egypt is a nation that cannot function like every other nation. It's like the natural bases have been removed. Whenever we try to rely on them again, they will not be there for us. What Yoshua is essentially saying is again and again, the world is coming to destroy you and God's saving you, which means the extent to which you're connected to God, you're going to make it. But the extent to which you drop that, they're going to come and destroy you. You don't survive anymore. So this is now a nation that's going to be created whose entire existence, whose only premise that can justify its existence, the only basis for existence is going to be the relationship with God. That's what's going to come out of Egypt. And that, in essence, is what God answers Avraham. You will surely know, because everything else is going to be taken away. And because their essential core is going to be attached to me, says God, what he's really saying to Avraham is, you don't realize you've done much more work than you realize you've done. You have built a relationship with me that by 3 generations is going to be so strong that when we strip everything away, it will emerge and it will attach itself to me. Its essence, bless you, will be mine. That's what God says. And so, yes, they may sin in the future, but they'll be able to, either through the offerings of the Beis HaMikdash or the other medrash that says the symbol of the various things Avraham did in that dream, in that covenant of the parts, also represented the exiles, right? So there'll be ways to punish the people, but it's like that their essence will be good. Their essence will be the relationship with God. So they might lose lots of individuals along the way. They might meet operations, but it's not going to be an operation on their heart. Their heart will be in the right place, so that nation will survive and make it through history and get to the end. That's in essence what seems to be the maneuver of the Haggadah here. Maybe Mitzvah Hashem elaborate more on how others express this, but this is just trying to give the context. So in other words, what the Haggadah is saying here is, let's jump back now. To really understand Egypt, we're about to enter Aram Yovedavi, Avi, the 4 verses that are what the farmer would say every year when they brought their first fruit to the Beis HaMikdash. This is really for the Chacham, for the wise child at this point. The simple child had their bit of the Haggadah. We were slaves, we became free. That's kind of done. There was amazing miracles. We'll wake you up again when we get to the miracles bit. The Rambam says that's really basically what you do. So, okay, but meanwhile we were slaves, we became free, thank you. The Chacham, the wise person, is going to understand this on a whole different level. The level that Yoshua gave to the people at the end of his life, the level of understanding, this is not we were slaves, we became free. That's a tiny part of it. We need to understand this in a much more radical way. This is the creation of, back to Manishtana, what's changed tonight. Something much more radical than that has changed. Something much more radical than that is the transformation that we underwent in Egypt. This was what guarantees our way through history, and this is what's oimed us, what stands us in every generation. There'll be forces that want us to be removed from the world, and Hashem will save us. And we have the first episode of that with Lavan HaArami. So right now we're going to walk straight into the 4 psukim. I'm going to read them to you inside the Torah, because they're going to be extremely familiar to you. They're basically Haggadah. Arami Ovedavi, we can actually read them straight in Haggadah. And Arami Ovedavi is a very difficult phrase to translate. Right? It's not clear in the commentaries how to translate it. The Haggadah gives 1, maybe 2 interpretations of it. The Haggadah's interpretation is an Aramean tried to obliterate my father. Okay? You can also read that my father was a lost Aramean. Right? Okay, whatever it is, it's interesting that that's the introduction. Let me read inside the Torah so you got the clear context of what's going on over here, because the verse carries on. Vayered Mitzrayim, he went down to Egypt. Vayagosham same art, and he dwelt there with very little. Right? Visham Lagoy, he became a nation. God of awesome, mighty and powerful, Varov and numerous. Or we'll see. But let's just read the full context in Parshas Kisaf. Okay, always good to see things in their context. Right at the beginning of Kisaf, we get the mitzvah of bringing the first fruit. Kisavoyal art, when you come to the land that Hashem gives you, you'll take the first fruit, Rashis Kol Pri Adam Shatovi Maritz, the first fruit that comes out of the land, and bring it to place it in a basket. Go to the place where God will rest his name. Go to the covenant will be in those days, and say to him, Haggadati Ayom. The second time we have the word Haggadah. Right? We had Haggadah and Haggadah and Vinchot, tell your child. We have Haggadah here. Haggadati Ayom. I'm doing a Haggadah today. To say that I've come to the land. And what do you say? The Kohen takes the basket. V'anisav amarta, you give a declaration, you declare. Rashi says you not kofri tov. I don't deny the good. This is called hakoras hatov, recognizing the good. And what do you say? Every year on Shavuos. Arami Ovedas, usually brought the Bikurim, the first fruit on Shavuos. You can bring them later as well. So this part of the Haggadah really is for Shavuos. Arami Ovedavi. And again, an Aramean oppressed or tried to obliterate my father, or my father was a lost Aramean. And he went down to Egypt, was there, dwelt there with very little, became a big, great nation. Vayireah son of Mitzrayim, verse number 2. Well, actually, number is 6 in chapter 26. But verse number 2 of the 4 verses, the Egyptians afflicted us. Vayanunu, right? Different words for affliction. They gave us really hard work. Passing number 3. We cried at Hashem, God of our ancestors. He heard our voice. He saw our affliction. The struggles, travail, it usually translates itself as, and our oppression. Number 4. God took us out of Egypt with a strong hand, outstretched arm, great awesomeness, signs and wonders. That's where we stop in the Haggadah. On Shavuos, we had another pasuk. And Hashem brought us to this land and gave us this amazing fruit, and then we had one more, and now I brought the beginning of my fruit to the Beis HaMikdash, and so on. That's it. So we stop before the 5th bit, which is we ended up in the land. Okay, we do the first 4. Now, obviously, if the Torah has told you this is how you recount, that's a good thing to analyze. But here is where the Mishnah said yesterday, Kol Amar Belidrosh, the more you analyze this, the Rambam uses this language, this is praiseworthy. Right? The Midrash says just doirish, you've got to analyze this parsha. You've got to really think about every single word in it, because every single word is going to take us on a bigger journey than the one before. So this is, if you're doing your own Haggadahs at home, you're doing your own Seder nights at home, really this is the bit to spend a lot of time. Really want you to go very quickly up till this point. And this is the bit, you pull out the 4 psukim, hand them around the table, and everyone can discuss them and analyze it. Of course, if you've got children at the table, this is highly impractical, because they've got 1,000 things to say up to the Haggadah up till this point, and by this point everyone's very hungry, and okay, you've got the mitzvah to eat the afikoman and get the afikoman by chatzos and so on. So what can you do? But this is really the epicenter of the Haggadah. This is really what we should be deeply focusing on. So at least now, before Seder night, we can focus a little bit on it, get what's going on over here. And let's go through the Medrash. The Haggadah quotes a bunch of real Midrashim on how to analyze these psukim. So let's start now from the beginning. Arami Ovedavi. So what has this got to do with the story? Why not just say that we were in Egypt? What Aramean afflicting my ancestor, what's it got to do? So the Haggadah has learnt it as Lavan. That's how most commentaries learn it. Lavan tried to destroy my father. And the Haggadah says, look what Lavan tried to do. Paro only tried to destroy the males. Lavan tried to destroy everybody. As it says, Arami Ovedavi. So what? What's that got to do with Egypt? What's Lavan got to do with anything? So you could say, Chava brings us out, others brings out, that really we've discussed 2 episodes until now, both of which are kind of forerunners, like a Maisa of a similar bonding. What happens with the ancestors reflects itself on what happens with the later generations. That the Torah had kind of 2 dress rehearsals, if you like, for Egypt. One was Avraham himself, right? Because Avraham went into Egypt, literally. His wife was essentially enslaved by Pharaoh. He would have been killed had they known who he was. Then Hashem released Sarah from Pharaoh's house with plagues and so on. So it was kind of a pre-run of a dry, like an exercise in advance of what's going to be. That's one thing. The next thing is Lavan. Lavan, there's many similarities to what happens with Lavan. Yaakov tries to leave. Lavan pursues him. It's the same story. 6 days. It's like leaving Egypt. He comes after him on the 3rd day, catches him up on the 6th day. He wants to kill him. Hashem intervenes. This time, instead of splitting the sea, he just comes to him in the night and tells him not to do anything. So there's a lot of similarities going on. Okay. And that's all fair. But that's not really what's going on. There's much more going on over here. So let me give you now, I forget who says it, one of the commentaries in the Haggadah says this, that there is a direct link between what Lavan tries to do and Yaakov ending down in Egypt. The direct link is actually, the question is when it says Lavan wanted to uproot everything, what's this referring to? So there's 2 possibilities. One is referring to the night he came upon Yaakov to capture him, bring him back, maybe kill everybody, whatever he was planning to do. And God says, don't do anything. But there was another La'akar, there was another point at which Lavan tried to destroy everything, which is when he originally traded Leah for Rachel. Yaakov was meant to go there, marry Rachel, and build the Jewish people. And instead, Lavan really almost destroyed the whole thing. And because of Lavan's move, the family remained perpetually split, because Lavan insisted Leah gets in the picture. We ended up with a broken family, and because that family, Yosef got sold into slavery. So really, the what seems like a relatively small affliction at the beginning, that was just about his trying to control everything, ends up almost destroying everything and leads us right down into Egypt. So that's also very powerful to understand, that persecutions can have long-term ramifications. One way or another, the other way of reading the Pasuk here, by the way, is Arami Ovedavi means my ancestor was a lost Aramean. Ibn Ezra says that can refer to Yaakov being lost in Lavan's land. It's a similar idea. I think there are those who even say it could refer to Avraham Avinu, in which case the Haggadah really is hints. One way or another, what all these interpretations are saying is the roots of Egypt are long before Egypt. That's the clear point that's coming out, and that's something the Haggadah has already dealt with. Okay, so even on your annual farmer's first fruit declaration, you always start by saying the roots of this story long predate the story. Very deep roots, going all the way back into history, all the way back into the ancestral generations. Okay, I'm not going to dwell longer on that, but that's just to be aware. Vayered Mitzrayim goes down to Egypt. Vayogosh, I'm not going to comment on everything the Haggadah says here. Vayogosh, so we learn that he didn't go to be there long permanently. His plan was to be there temporarily, right? Same Marty went there with very little, right? We say that 70 souls. And then he became a goy. Now this is very interesting. Vayisham legoy. He became there a nation. The Haggadah quotes the Medrash that says, Melamed shahayu mitsuyonim sham. It tells us they were outstanding there. What does that mean? What's that got to do with saying he became a nation? So the answer we know is the famous, there's lots of midrashim on what merit did the Jewish people have, the Israelites have to come out. After all, we have plenty of sources, starting from Yechezkel himself, that indicate they were serving idols in Egypt, they were on the lowest level of impurity in Egypt. So what merit did they have? And different midrashim give different things. But the primary source that we hear is that there were 3 things they kept distinct there. Now God doesn't say it explicitly, but it's pretty clear. What are those 3?
Names.
They kept their names, their dress, and language, right? Yeah, clothing, yes. Clothing was the dress, so that was the second one, right? Yeah. Right? Names, clothing, language, the 3 things they kept unique. But so what? They're not mitzvahs. I mean, you could argue Lashon HaKodesh is a semi-mitzvah, close to mitzvah. They're on the 49th level of spiritual impurity. Well, what's that got to do with anything? But it's important enough that the Torah emphasized they became there a nation. They had not been a nation before. You see, so there's a few dynamics happening here. The point seems to be this, that,
Isn't there a mitzvah not to act like non-Jews though, like not to go about their
Yeah, but it's not clear that, well, it's not so clear if that really, but the mitzvah chukas are not to go in their statutes. I mean, it depends how you learn in the Shulchan Aruch, right? It might only be things that are linked to idolatry. It's not clear that the names and clothing by itself, if there's a logic to the clothing, like, for example, Jews didn't invent what you call pants, we call trousers in England, right? But you can wear them because they've got logical things to do. It's like what? So it's not so clear. Maybe, but at best that would be half of one. But the main reason for that prohibition is not to follow their idolatrous practices. They were following their idolatrous practices, so it'd be pretty useless to be like, we keep our Jewish names while we serve idols. That kind of misses the point, right? The Rambam includes that one of the 51 mitzvahs of not serving idols. So. And that seems to be how many of the notes of Shulchan Aruch come out as well. So either way, so what's going on? So it seems as follows. They went into Egypt as a family. They became a nation. The very fact that they were able to stay distinct, so they were a sub-nation that was separate, was actually a merit. They knew they had something in their ancestral tradition that had to be preserved. They weren't able to preserve its values, for the most part, though Shevet Levi may have done. Fascinatingly enough, very few midrashim say that the merit of coming out of Egypt was anything to do with the tribe of Levi. The Rambam says the tribe of Levi never served idolatry. There's like one medrash, I think, of all the different midrashim, if I'm not mistaken, there's one, I think, that used that as a possible reason they came out, but almost all midrashim don't list it, interestingly enough. And part of the general rule, the nation's judged collectively. If most of the nation serving idols, it's considered the nation served idols. So, one way or another, but they did know there's this thing called being part of this people that has to make it into Egypt and has to come out the other side. And that, it seems, was already something. Enough. Not yet enough by itself, but enough to stop them completely disappearing in Egypt. And that was important. Okay? By itself, this doesn't get to where we need to get to, but it was something they were aware of. Okay, then we carry on and say, this Vahi Sham, they became Godol V'Rov, Godol Otzim V'Rov, 3 words. And of course, Chazal are always going to do this, the rabbis are always going to do this. They're very, very sensitive to this. If the Torah uses 3 words and we use one, it's because each word is adding something that the other is not giving us. So Godol and Otzim, we quote the pasuk. They were yatzmu, right? The Godel means they were great. Otzum seems to be powerful, and in fact, we quote the part of the Torah where there's 6 different words for the type of growth they underwent. So there's qualitative growth, quantitative growth, but the problem with that is then what's the last word doing? Varov, and there were many. That's surely already included in the word Godel. They became numerically great, and they were also very powerful. Right? What's this Varov? And here the Haggadah does something interesting. It goes back to the metaphor of the plant, and it quotes the psukim of Yechezkel, Ravava ketzemach hasadan asatich. Right there, the pasuk in Yechezkel uses the word Rav a number of times. You basically you matured, you grew up like the plants of a field. Vatirbi vatigdali, and then we use the metaphor of a young girl growing up and maturing, and God passes over us. Actually, that pasuk comes earlier in Yechezkel, and sees us in the blood and says, with your blood you will live, with your blood you will live, right? Now there's many, many different dimensions to this metaphor. Are we talking about the natal blood of the baby just been born? Are we talking about the blood of the female maturing? Are we talking, of course, in Egypt, it was the double blood of the circumcision and the Pesach offering. There's many, many dimensions. And of course, there's the hint that a lot of your survival will be with the blood of exile and so on. Okay, but one way or another, what's happening is that the word Varov is implying there are changes taking place, preparing you from birth to relationship. Although you can't see it superficially, now you're on the lowest level of impurity, you've got a distinct cultural identity, you're aware of something that's not yet manifest, but inside you changes are happening. The seed in the ground is starting to grow. How's that growth manifest? At this point, we don't yet know. There's processes going on, even as you seem to have nothing more than just, at this stage, cultural distinction. Then comes the next pasuk about the crushing blow. I'm just going to cover it briefly out. The Egyptians did evil to us, and the Haggadah will say that means they planned, right? That was the manipulative plans of Pharaoh. Vayanunu, right? They actually afflict us. That's when they start putting taxes and taskmasters over us to build the store cities. The hard work, then they intensified that. So now at this point we get to the word of Vayavidu Mitzrayim b'nei Yisrael b'forech. They did this word b'forech. B'forech is a strong word. It's something crushing. Okay, we were crushed. So you got this seed kind of sprouting, growing on the one hand, but completely crushed on the other hand. And the third pasuk says, now this is where everything now comes together. The Maharal's talking about, the Ritzchak is talking about, the Ramchal is talking about the seed that is decomposing, that is completely crushed. We've lost our physical ability to survive. As we said earlier in the Haggadah, if Hashem hadn't taken us out, we'd have been lost in Egypt. Right? It says we'd have been slaves to Pharaoh forever. So the obvious question people ask, even by the time the Haggadah was written, it wasn't really had pharaohs in Egypt anymore. Surely, okay, we'd have just melted away into general Egyptian civilization. We would be, to this day, Egyptians in Egypt. That's what we'd be. So everything is crushed. Physically, we have no chance of survival. No group of slaves ever emerged from Egypt as an independent people. They just became lost in Egyptian society. Spiritually, we've also lost our ability to survive. The Gemara says even a week later, when it came to the splitting of the sea, and Hashem tells the angels, split the sea, save the Israelites, they turn around and go, why? These are idol worshippers and these are idol worshippers. Fascinating. First of all, what does it mean an angel argues with God? God says split the sea, you split the sea. Well, what are you doing? You're a human? Humans do these crazy, and even a human, why would you argue with God? He says do something, do it. But second of all, didn't they bring at that point the Pesach offering and so on? Had they not done circumcision? So it seems, first of all, just to understand what a malach is. A malach is, today we have a very good metaphor for it. It's like a conscious AI, if you like. Basically, it's an algorithm, meaning it can only do what it's programmed to do. Whenever Chazal say this, the rabbis say that the angels say to God, but we can't do it. It's a bit like saying the program is saying to God, we don't know how to do this. We are programmed to save the good guys and punish the bad. You're telling us to operate that program here with the sea. We can't. We're spinning our cogs. The inputs, we're lost. We got stuck in a loop, so we can't operate. And the reason so why did God do it? Why did God tell them to do something they couldn't do? Because he wants us to know that in the algorithmic world of the normal operating systems of creation, this couldn't work. You're not coming out under that system. In the world the angels can detect and understand you don't exist. You would have been lost in Egypt. So physically we're gone, we can't make it out under the normal operating systems of the natural world. And even on the kind of spiritual inner programming of creation, apparently, even though we've done a carbon Pesach, it didn't tilt the scale sufficiently that we were able to survive and exist. So in every world under the natural order or the supernatural order, we cannot exist. And that will remain even after Egypt's finished. Then comes the third pasuk. But, says God to Abraham, and now it comes to manifestation, you don't realize there is a gene. Go back to this ancestral gene, the 3 generations. It now sits inside your children, and when everything's stripped away, it will sprout. And it's the ability to cry out to Hashem, Elokei Avosenu, God of our ancestors. The ancestral relationship comes back. And that's all. That's it. In this psukim, that's it. Nothing more about our merit. That we cry. Well, the depth behind this, of course, is that became the basis of our existence. In essence, we said, Hashem, we don't want the natural world. We don't want the angel world. We want you. That's it. In this half a pasuk, that's what's been said. Hashem, the God of our ancestors. And we therefore, implicit within this is the bedrock and basis of our existence moving forward from now and forever is you. Vayishma Hashem es kolenu, he heard our voice. Vayaras anyenu, he saw our affliction. Veslam aleinu v'esachatenu, all these various things. He hears our voice. It says in these days the Bnei Yisrael cried out, and it went all the way up to God from their work. He heard our voice. Then now this is funny. You'd say it's the other way around. Right. Then we say in the Haggadah, he remembers the covenant of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. He saw our affliction. That means the problems we had, that we couldn't even live as married couples because of the affliction going on. The children were being killed, and then the pressure. So you'd think it would be the other way around. He'd see all the pain and so on, and then listen to the ancestral covenant. But no. Once the ancestral covenant's kicked in, now we can zoom in and go, right, now we've got to get rid of all the pressure and the affliction and all of this. Right? In other words, it was all there to produce something that will last forever. this is the Manish Tana going back to what's changing. What's changing here is everything that had been until now in a potential state is going to be radically redefined. We're no longer going to have a world where our survival can be justified in the world of the angels or the world of the natural order. In fact, the Yitzhak Isaac Chava goes much further. He says, every nation on earth has its angel force, if you like, its spiritual algorithm that drives it, but not Yisrael. Which means the minute we go back into that and we try to survive just on our geopolitical prowess, our whatever abilities we have, our diplomatic strengths if we have any, or even trying to calculate our kind of score in the angelic world, we don't make it. It's only going to be on the basis of Hashem. Now we are a bit out of time, but will come the fourth verse. The fourth verse actually was going to pull us out of Egypt. Okay, so but as is Hashem, next week for those who are still around, we'll try. I'm going to actually try. I think last year we only managed to have 3 sessions. We have 4, so hopefully we're going to be able to cover most of that. Maybe we'll see if we get a whole over most of that. God, as Hashem. But next week in Mitzvah Hashem will then deal with the actual coming out of Egypt, which we then spend quite a fair amount of the Haggadah dealing with it. So we've more commentary on this 4th pasuk than pretty much all the others put together. So that's where we'll have to come to. But this is where we've got to so far. With that, we'll have to finish.